1,000 years ago, the world existed in a state of quiet grandeur that modern minds struggle to grasp. The earth was not yet divided by borders drawn in ink, nor shaped by machines that scrape mountains into roads and cities. Instead, the continents breathed as living beings, vast, ancient, and mysterious. Forests stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles, dark and thick with stories carried in the rustle of leaves. The mountains towered with an authority that needed no explanation. Rivers wound through the land like veins of memory, whispering truths older than the civilizations built upon their banks. In that age, humanity lived closer to the pulse of the world. Nights were darker, but the stars were brighter, so bright, in fact, that people navigated by constellations as though they were reading maps etched into the heavens. Fires burned with a glow that invited stories, and each story carried the weight of centuries. Children grew up listening to tales of ancestors whose deeds were so extraordinary that they seemed almost divine. Yet no one questioned them. The world was young enough then that the impossible still felt familiar. Time moved differently in those centuries. Kingdoms did not rise in months or fall in weeks. They grew slowly, like great oaks, shaped by generations of hands. Knowledge was not stored in books, where pages could be burned or lost. It lived in the people, in their songs, their rituals, their architecture, their way of listening to the world. Memory was not something kept, it was something lived. But beneath the calm rhythm of daily life, a deeper current moved. Forces unseen by most guided the destiny of entire nations. The rulers who sat on thrones of gold were often not the true wielders of power. Behind them stood quiet advisors, wandering sages, scholars of the unseen, and ancient bloodlines who carried knowledge that stretched back far beyond the kingdoms they served. These individuals did not seek fame or recognition. Their purpose was older than politics, to preserve the memory of what humanity once was and what it could be again. The world remembered itself in fragments. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments section where you are watching from and the exact time it is for you. Now, let's continue. The quiet tension that settled over the world did not announce itself with thunder or prophecy. It crept in softly, through the pauses in conversations, the unease in rulers who suddenly dreamt of things they could not explain, through the subtle shifts in nature that only shepherds, monks, and wanderers noticed. But these small changes accumulated like grains of sand forming a dune, until even ordinary people began to feel that something unseen was moving beneath the surface of their lives. Travelers crossing vast distances sensed it first. Caravans journeying along ancient trade routes reported that familiar landmarks felt strangely altered, as though the land remembered a different shape. Fishermen spoke of tides that no longer obeyed the moon. Hunters whispered that animals behaved as if listening for an approaching storm that had no clouds. Traders arriving in distant markets found that the stories being told there mirrored rumors from their own homelands, as though a single invisible wind carried the same whispers across continents. Meanwhile, the guardians, the scattered, hidden watchers of memory, felt the shift more intensely. They recognized the signs from the stories passed down through generations. The pattern was stirring again. The wheel was turning, The world was beginning to remember. They met in secret, priests behind closed temple doors, scholars in candlelit rooms, elders gathered under night skies. Each brought fragments of evidence, strange celestial alignments, ancient symbols found in unexpected places, rituals behaving differently than they had for centuries. No one understood the full meaning, but they all knew the feeling. Across the deserts of Arabia, members of the Brethren of Purity pored over ancient manuscripts written in codes so complex that only a handful of minds could decipher them. These texts spoke of previous ages, epochs in which humanity had mastered sciences far beyond their time. Tools that could harness the power of sound, vehicles that could fly, maps that showed continents now submerged beneath the ocean. Machines powered not by fire or water, but by something far older. One manuscript warned that when humanity grew too confident in its own creations, neglecting the discipline that kept power in balance, the world itself intervened. Not as punishment, but as correction, a reset, swift, merciless, and absolute. The brethren feared that such a moment was approaching once again. On the other side of the world, in the golden lands of West Africa, the priests of the forest kingdoms felt the same pull. They believed that the earth held memory the way a drum holds rhythm, echoing events long past. In their temples, carved symbols began to vibrate faintly during rituals, something that had not happened for generations. Young initiates reported dreams of structures they had never seen: tall towers, glowing stones, machines humming with energy. The elders recognized these dreams as echoes from the last age, rising through bloodlines that had preserved fragments of memory. Far to the north, in the snow-covered lands of the Norse tribes, leaders guarding sacred relics noticed unusual activity. The stone said to reveal the destiny of kings, the one whispered to have descended from the sky, began to emit a faint warmth when touched. It had been cold for centuries. Only once before in their long history had it warmed, during the fall of a great empire in an age now lost. In the east, monks living in remote mountain monasteries observed celestial patterns that defied their mathematical tables. They recalculated the movements of the heavens, but each night brought new anomalies. Stars flickered in ways that hinted at deeper cosmic shifts. Some believed the veil between ages was thinning, the boundary separating the present world from the memories of the ones that came before. Merchants traveling the Silk Road reported meeting strangers who wore clothes unlike any they had seen, carrying objects crafted from materials no blacksmith could identify. These strangers spoke of distant lands beyond the edges of every known map, lands filled with ruins of unimaginable design. When asked where they came from, they answered only, from where the world forgot itself, and then disappeared without a trace. The guardians across the world, though separated by geography and culture, shared another realization. Forces of ambition were awakening as well. Those who sought power, true, unrestrained power, felt the same stirring in the air. But where the guardians felt responsibility, these rulers and opportunists felt opportunity. They sensed that a door was beginning to open, a door that had been sealed since the last age fell. And through that door lay secrets that could reshape kingdoms and empires. But unlocking knowledge without understanding its cost is the most dangerous act any civilization can commit. As the world drifted toward this threshold, tensions between wisdom and ambition increased. Scholars eager for recognition pushed beyond the ethical boundaries that had quietly protected humanity for ages. Kings and sultans sponsored expeditions that dug too deeply into forbidden ruins. Alchemists experimented with energies they could not control. Mystics performed rituals older than their own bloodlines, unaware that the slightest miscalculation could unleash forces meant to remain dormant. One night, in a small monastery perched along a rugged cliff, an old monk gazed at the sky and saw something he had seen only once before in childhood, a star appearing where no star should exist. Its sudden presence was a warning known only to a handful of elders. He fell to his knees, tears filling his eyes. "It begins again," he whispered. Meanwhile, in the bustling markets of a distant kingdom, a young girl with no training stood near a stone tablet cracked with age. Without knowing why, she traced her fingers over the markings, and the symbols glowed faintly beneath her touch. By the time she stepped back, terrified, a crowd had begun to watch. Rumors spread. Some called her blessed. Others cursed her as a witch. But the guardians knew what such signs meant. Old blood had awakened in a new generation. For memory does not choose its vessels by rank or wealth. It rises where it will. And so the world of 1,000 years ago found itself divided between those who sensed the coming change and those who remained blind to it. Ordinary people continued their daily lives, farming, trading, building, praying, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was shifting. But the watchers, the guardians, the ambitious, the sensitive, they felt it like a heartbeat growing louder in the distance. The old knowledge was returning. The cycle was preparing to turn, and the world stood at the edge of something vast. They felt the shift in their dreams first, visions that came uninvited, filled with places they had never seen, faces they had never met, and symbols they could not understand. A shepherd sleeping beneath the open sky would awaken suddenly, his heart pounding, recalling a tower made of stone and light rising above a lake he had never visited. A merchant resting in a caravan tent would dream of a bridge carved with markings identical to those found in distant temples, but he had never traveled beyond his trade routes. A child, barely old enough to speak, would scribble shapes in the dirt that matched the constellations of an age lost to time. These dreams were fragments of memory bubbling up from the depths of the collective human soul. They surfaced when the world stood too close to a turning point, when the layers separating past from present thinned enough for old echoes to seep through. And the echoes only grew stronger. In the deep forests of what would one day be Europe, tribes gathered for seasonal rites as their ancestors had done for centuries. But that year, the wind moved differently through the branches. The firelight flickered against carved stones with unusual intensity. Elders noticed the animals, the wolves, the stags, the ravens, behaving as if aware of something approaching. Even the trees seemed restless, their leaves whispering warnings in tones too soft for most to hear. Across the Mediterranean, in the grand courts of rising kingdoms, political tension simmered. Ambassadors argued with increasing urgency, not because of any specific threat, but because of an unspoken pressure bearing down on everyone. Kings found themselves embroiled in conflicts sparked by trivial misunderstandings, as though some invisible hand was pushing them toward chaos. Advisors cautioned them against rash decisions, sensing that the world stood on unstable footing. But ambition is louder than caution, and ambition thrives in ignorance. Rulers who felt the stirring of old power became obsessed with acquiring whatever remnants of it they could. Expeditions were launched in search of lost artifacts rumored to grant wisdom or influence. Scholars were commanded to translate ancient texts, even if they did not understand the dangers of misinterpretation. Priests confiscated relics from smaller temples, claiming divine authority but secretly hoping to discover hidden energies. And from the shadows, opportunists, men and women who understood just enough to be dangerous, began maneuvering themselves into positions of influence. The Guardians watched with growing unease. They had spent centuries carefully shielding the world from knowledge it was not ready to wield, protecting wisdom that required discipline and balance. But a new generation of seekers, reckless, curious, ambitious, were breaking the seals that had kept humanity safe through countless cycles. If even one fragment of ancient power fell into the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet the Guardians faced another challenge. They themselves were divided. Some believed humanity should finally reclaim all that was lost, that the suffering and stagnation of the age were signs that people needed awakening, that knowledge should no longer be hidden but shared. They argued that suppression only prolonged ignorance, and that the world was ready for a new era of enlightenment. Others disagreed fiercely. They believed humanity was closer to destruction now than ever before. They saw ambition rising faster than wisdom. They recognized the same patterns that had preceded the collapse of previous civilizations, patterns of arrogance, division, and thirst for absolute control. They warned that revealing the old truths now would only accelerate disaster. Between these factions, tension grew. Secret councils split. Old alliances fractured. Messages carved in coded symbols were intercepted and misinterpreted. Rituals meant to preserve balance were disrupted. And as the Guardians argued among themselves, the world slipped further toward the edge. Meanwhile, the ordinary people continued living, unaware that they stood on the boundary between ages. They tilled fields, prayed to their gods, raised children, crafted goods, fought small wars, and built homes. Yet even they could not escape the shift in the air. Strange omens multiplied. In a fishing village, the sea retreated unnaturally far before sweeping back with a force that destroyed everything along the shore. Survivors spoke of a distant rumble that shook the bones before the wave arrived. In a mountain settlement, an entire herd of livestock collapsed in unison as though struck by an invisible energy. In a desert city, the ground split open one night, revealing perfectly carved chambers beneath the sand. Chambers that no civilization in that region had the knowledge to build. And each time such an event occurred, a message spread among those who knew how to listen. The past is trying to return. In hidden places, the Guardians gathered one final time, not in one location, but across continents. each circle unaware of the other, yet bound by the same instinct. They consulted the stars. They interpreted omens. They reviewed records that stretched back thousands of years. And they reached the same conclusion. The world was approaching a moment of revelation. But revelation is never gentle. Revelation is sharp, unforgiving. It carves away illusion. The question was not whether the world would change. The question was how. Would humanity rediscover its forgotten wisdom and rise into a new golden age? Or would mankind repeat its oldest mistake, allow desire to outrun discipline, and fall once more into ruin? There was no certainty. But everyone, guardians, rulers, common folk, even the earth itself, felt that something vast was coming, something ancient, something inevitable. One night, under a moon so bright it seemed close enough to touch, a wanderer traveling alone on a quiet road stopped suddenly. The air grew still around him. The world seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence, he felt it. A shiver through the earth, a tremor in the sky, a whisper at the edge of consciousness. Not in words, but in meaning. It begins. The whisper faded almost as quickly as it came, but its meaning lingered in the wanderer's bones long after the night resumed its usual rhythm. He stood there beneath the moon, uncertain whether what he felt had come from within or from the world itself. Yet he knew, with the certainty one cannot explain, that something immense had shifted. And as he resumed walking, he carried with him a faint sense of both dread and wonder, like a man who has glimpsed a storm forming far beyond the horizon. Across the world, others felt the same tremor in their own ways. In a bustling coastal kingdom, a blacksmith hammering iron suddenly paused. The metal beneath his hammer vibrated strangely, resonating with a pitch he had never heard before. His apprentice looked up in confusion, sensing his master's unease, but neither spoke. The sound passed quickly, leaving no physical trace, yet the blacksmith felt as though something had awakened inside the metal itself, a memory older than its forged shape. On a remote island far from trade routes, an old woman tending to her herbs stopped and pressed her palm to the earth. She had felt shifts like this only twice in her lifetime, and each had preceded events that reshaped entire regions. The soil felt alive beneath her touch, trembling lightly as if stirring from sleep. She whispered a prayer, not out of fear, but respect. The earth was speaking again. High in the mountains, a group of monks meditating in silence opened their eyes at the same moment, their breaths synchronized without intention. Their abbot, a man who had spent decades studying the subtle rhythms of the world, opened his eyes as well. He needed no words to explain what they all sensed. The boundary between the present and the forgotten was thinning. And in the courts of powerful rulers, political advisors found themselves increasingly restless. Decisions that once felt straightforward suddenly seemed delicate, fraught with unseen consequences. Some officials awoke at night with the unshakable feeling that something watched them from beyond the veil of their understanding. The most sensitive among them developed a deep discomfort, as though each policy they enacted contributed to a tension they could not name. Yet the world continued outwardly as it always had. Ships sailed, markets bustled, Children laughed in dusty streets. Kingdoms negotiated alliances while eyeing each other with suspicion. Farmers planted their crops in cycles passed down through generations. Merchants told tales of fortune along winding roads. The everyday life of humanity moved forward, unaware of the ancient forces gathering in the quiet spaces between moments. This veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary is always thinnest just before a turning, and the turning sharpened further. Night after night, the stars shifted subtly, imperceptible to most, but unsettling to those who studied them. Constellations that had remained stable for centuries seemed to drift slightly, as though the heavens themselves were adjusting their posture. A particular cluster of stars burned brighter than usual, shimmering with an unnatural intensity. It was a sign mentioned in multiple ancient texts, though few alive could recognize it. In a hidden chamber buried beneath a forgotten temple, a group of elders huddled around a small stone that pulsed faintly. It was said to be one of the last relics intact from the age before the current cycle, a device whose purpose no one fully understood, but whose activation always signaled a shift in the world's foundation. Tonight, for the first time in nearly 500 years, it pulsed with steady rhythm. One elder, her voice trembling, whispered, "So the cycle turns again." Her words echoed through the chamber like a prophecy. Meanwhile, far from such sacred spaces, ordinary people began experiencing moments that defied explanation. A farmer saw a flash of light in the sky that moved unlike any star or comet. A child claimed to see glowing figures in a forest, beings she described as neither human nor ghost, but something in between. A sailor navigating by starlight found his compass spinning wildly one night, only to realign the moment he abandoned the magnetic needle and followed an intuition he could not justify. Supernatural or psychological, no one knew. But these moments accumulated, threading through the consciousness of the world like sparks seeking dry grass. Knowledge, true knowledge, wants to survive. And as something ancient awakened, old truths pushed their way toward the surface. Knowledge, true knowledge, wants to survive. And as something ancient awakened, old truths pushed their way toward the surface.